Now, this weekend, we had the horrific news of the murder of a farming couple in KwaZulu-Natal. The news broke just hours after a nationwide protest against farm murders on Saturday. Glenn and Vida Rafferty were gunned down in Normandin in KwaZulu-Natal. The suspects ransacked the house before making off with their vehicle, which has since been recovered. Now, this afternoon, farm murders were discussed in Parliament. Deputy President David Mabuza has already indicated he'll meet with the Interministerial Committee on Land Reform to talk about the spike in attacks. And tomorrow, the Police Minister Bheki Cele will visit the Rafferty farm. South Africa's crime stats do now record farm murders as a separate category, amid growing concerns about why people are being targeted on farms and how this might impact food security in South Africa. I'm joined now by Dr. Johan Burger of the Institute for Security Studies. Good evening, Dr. Burger. Thanks very much for your time. Could you first of all just give us an understanding of the stats on farm murders? What are they telling us? Are they on the increase?
Good evening, Sally. I think it's almost irrelevant whether it increases or not. My sense is that it fluctuates from time to time, but it remains relatively high. If you look at the 2019-2020 stats from SAPS, they recorded 49 farm murders. And the Transvaal Agricultural Union of South Africa, that also keeps their own records, showed 54 farm murders for 2019. So it remains at that level every year, sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher. So, whether it increases or not becomes irrelevant.
54 murders are horrific and everyone is an absolute tragedy, but in a country where that is often the daily toll in murders, some people might say, why the special focus on farm murders? Why do you believe it needs to be seen as a separate crime? Are there distinguishing characteristics that make it important that we see farm murders in a separate category?
Yeah, absolutely. I think farm murders should be and must be a separate category for a number of reasons. First of all, the level of brutality distinguishes this from most other crimes, and we often see brutal crimes elsewhere, but this has become the pattern during farm attacks. Remember that we are recording only those murdered. Many others are maimed for life, and the families are left alone, very often wife and children alone, sometimes only children alone. And then, of course, the criminal attacks on farms includes also other violent crimes such as torture, rape, and so on. And that's almost become the norm during farm attacks, something which you sometimes see in urban areas, but that's not become the norm in urban attacks. And then, of course, there are all the other crimes such as, large-scale stock theft, crop theft. And so farm attacks, I think, in many ways, remains a unique type of crime.
Is it a crime targeting white people? And I ask this because that's the contentious issue. We know that not only white people are killed, but there is a strong call for this to be described and to be labelled as a hate crime. There's a strong body of belief in South Africa that this is targeted against white people on farms, perhaps to do with the very sensitive issue of land reform. What is your view? Is it a hate crime or is it not?
Well, this is really very difficult to say without, without solid research. The last study into the reasons and the causes for farm attacks was carried out in the early 2000s, and a report was published in 2003. That is 17 years ago. I think the political situation, especially in view of more of the radical statements made by some political leaders, may have changed the situation to the extent that in some attacks, race or hatred may play a role, but it's difficult to assess this without good research. And I support the recent calls by some political parties that we need to research this again and to look at whether and to what extent the situation has changed as far as race or hatred plays a role in these attacks. But as I said, there are a few incidents that were reported in the media where certainly, people could make or draw that conclusion that in that particular case, racial prejudice or hatred played a role. But I don't think that is the general motivation for these attacks.
What do you think the motive is? I mean, if we look at the Rafferty killing on the weekend, they took the car and I think cell phones. It doesn't seem on the surface that theft is the motive, or is it?
You will have certain incidents where it's difficult until the case is properly investigated to determine what the real cause or motivation for that particular crime is. So it's difficult to look at specific incidents or isolated incidents and then to try and generalize that. I think the general motive for most of these attacks will probably be something that has to do with greed, with the motive may be to go and rob people because there's this belief that all farmers are rich and there's lots to be gained from these attacks. But then you find attacks that are clearly motivated by something else. The previous research I referred to said that there were a number of these attacks where clearly the motive was intimidation, trying to drive the occupants of that farm away from that farm. There are also incidents where work relations may have played a role, but these are minor in my view.
I have to ask you about the political energy around that. We saw the debate in Parliament this afternoon. We know that the police minister is going to be at the Rafferty farm tomorrow. We also know that the Deputy President is holding an interministerial committee. The KZN Premier was on the farm today. And we know that the police minister's also instituted a rural safety policy. Are we doing the right things to not only combat this crime, but secure our farms so that food security can be maintained?
Yes, absolutely. Apart from the human factor, the victims of all of these atrocious crimes, I think we must understand that our farmers are the source of our food. And we need to protect that source. It's a very important and a strategic source that we need to look after. And, apart from some of the more radical political statements that we still hear, I think from the rural party, government, and other important political parties, we increasingly now see a complete change in terms of publicly stating support for our farmers and for the rural community in a broader sense. There's also a move now, as you said, the President himself made statements in support of rural safety and of understanding how important food security is. But we've seen the Minister making the same statements. We've now heard the Deputy Minister, President saying the same things. In Parliament, we have debates about the issue. And certainly from the police's side, we've seen a huge move towards improving rural safety. There's the rural safety strategy that was updated last year, 2019. I think it's a very practical and implementable plan. It still needs a lot of support in terms of resources and in terms of groups and people coming together and working together. But I'm happy to say that there is a very positive drive now from the political to the officialdom and from the organized agriculture towards working together to improve rural safety and hopefully also to protect the source of our food.
Well, thank you very much for your time this evening, Dr. Johan Burger of the Institute for Security Studies.